please come. I need you. This is I need you.
On July 28, 2018, police arrested sisters Christina, Angelina, and Maria Khachaturian, and they never imagined the huge public outrage that would follow, dividing opinions in Russia. Some compare it to the impact of the O.J. Simpson case in the United States. The story of the Khachaturian sisters and their father, Mikhail, begins in Azerbaijan, where the patriarch was born in 1962. Coming from a conservative Armenian family with strong ties to the Orthodox Church and Caucasian customs, they were forced to leave their country due to a historical event. In February 1988, the Supreme Soviet of Nagorno-Karabakh requested to join the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic, but Azerbaijan rejected the decision, leading to protests in both countries. Ethnic tensions and demonstrations led to violent clashes in Sumkayit and Baku, where the Armenian population was attacked. Mikhail fled Baku with his family to avoid violence. They arrived in Moscow with plans to emigrate to America, but due to paperwork and family matters, they stayed in the Russian capital. In 1996, in Moscow, he met Aurelia Dunduk, who later became his wife and mother of his children. Aurelia and Mikhail's marriage was not exactly a fairy tale. As Aurelia tells it, on the very day of the wedding, just before the ceremony, Mikhail hit her. Despite the tears, they went and got married. This situation continued for 20 years. Mikhail did not restrain himself even in front of relatives or strangers, feeling no shame for his violence. The Khachaturians lived in a two-room apartment with Mikhail's mother, sister, and nephew. 10 people shared the same space. The man's decision. Despite appearing to be pious and following strict religious rules, Mikhail was superstitious, imposing severe rules for the family, especially for his wife, whom he forbade to work and restricted from going out. The family shared Mikhail's patriarchal views, arguing that Aurelia should endure beatings as a good wife. In this environment, the family grew up. Aurelia, at the age of 19, became pregnant with their first child, Sergei. In 1999, Christina was born, a year later Angelina, and in 2001, Maria. The first to suffer Mikhail's abuse was Sergei, bullied and beaten under educational pretexts. When he graduated at 16, Mikhail threw him out of the house. The same story was repeated with Aurelia in 2015. Not only did he expel her, but he also forbade her to see her daughters, threatening her with death if she tried. Terrified, Aurelia fled, knowing of her husband's violence, and convinced that he would make good on his threats. For 2 decades, she endured beatings and abuse from Mikhail. When she had the courage to ask the police for help, she was ignored. In a moment of desperation, she went so far as to cut herself with a hunting knife he owned. Even so, no one did anything to help her. Following the absence of the eldest son and Aurelia, Mikhail's violence was turned against his daughters, on whom he imposed a series of unbearable tasks. He regularly beat them and subjected them to cruel treatment that included forcing them to be intimate. He demanded that they always be available to his requests and come at the first call. He had a special bell that he rang, and as soon as they heard it, they had to run immediately to attend to him, regardless of whether it was day or night, and do what he ordered, bringing water, food, and various other things. As a consequence of these events, Christina, one of the sisters, tried to take her own life, but was resuscitated by the doctors. It is not known if it was for fear of being told of her actions or for the pure pleasure of treating them as his property. The man was isolating them, which was detrimental to the girl's education. Maria and Angelina attended the same grade, but in the last few years they were almost never allowed to go to school because their father forced them to take care of him. As the sisters later recounted, their father constantly threatened them with different weapons. He also installed a camera so he could watch them when he was not present at home. Among the horrible insanities to which the subject subjected his 3 daughters, one example was forcing them to eat the hair of the family dog. This was happening in the 21st century, and everyone was watching. Neighbors, teachers, and even my daughter's friends and our parents witnessed how Mikhail treated them badly. Although the school psychologist tried to talk to them and my husband about our family situation, the neighbors and teachers preferred not to interfere and did not give us any significant support, which unfortunately was not uncommon in Russia. In 2017, Due to pressure from the Russian Orthodox Church and those upholding traditional values, the parliament passed the slapping law. This law removed the criminalization of domestic violence, considering it only an administrative offense. In addition, Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a decree that reduced sanctions against domestic violence, punishing it only with fines. In this context, it was not surprising that when the psychologist tried to talk to the girl's father, Mikhail threatened him, telling him not to interfere in family affairs. In 2018, the Khachaturian sisters were practically prisoners at home, suffering physical and mental abuse from their father. Their mother and brother knew nothing, but it was easy to tell from what the two of them experienced before they were kicked out. The worst part was that their grandmother and paternal family accepted everything as normal, thinking that Mikhail was protecting them to lead an honorable life. On the evening of July 27, 2018, Mikhail returned home from treatment at the Solovok Psychiatric and Neurological Center. Entering his apartment, he was angry about alleged expenses and disorder, blaming his daughters, and called them one by one. He locked them in a room and sprayed pepper spray in their faces. The substance gave Christina such a severe asthma attack that she fainted. After punishing his daughters, Mikhail went to sleep on a couch. It was at that moment that Angelina and Maria decided that this day would be the last day they would endure the abuse. At night, while his father slept on the couch, Angelina, 18, sneaked up and hit him over the head with a hammer, followed by Maria, 17, who wounded him with a hunting tool with which the man often threatened them. But Mikhail was as strong as a bull, so he woke up and tried to defend himself and leave the apartment. Christina, the oldest of the three 19-year-olds, upon hearing the commotion and seeing what was happening, took the same can of pepper spray that her father had used and sprayed it in the face to prevent him from catching one of her sisters. In the middle of the Khachaturians' family quarrel, Angelina took Maria's knife and gave the final blow to the father who had mistreated them until that moment. The reaction of one of the sisters after the crime was recorded in a video. Afterwards, the three girls cut their arms with a knife to simulate defense, as if their father had attacked them. After that, they called the police and an ambulance. When they arrived at the building in Altufevskoye, Moscow, the autopsy revealed Mikhail's body with multiple knife wounds, as well as cuts to the chest and neck, according to the police report. In their search of the house, the police took several weapons that belonged to Mikhail. There was everything: a knife, a hammer, a crossbow, a rifle, 2 air pistols, a traumatic weapon, 16 bullets, and 16 darts. The traumatic weapons fired rubber and pepper shells. They cause a lot of pain, but do not lead to death. The next day, Christina, Angelina, and Maria, his 3 daughters, were arrested and accused of being responsible for their father's death. During interrogation, they admitted to the crime. According to what they told, Mikhail beat them, humiliated them, and also subjected them to moral and sexual abuse over the years. The motive, according to the investigators' report, was a very strained personal relationship, as the father caused them moral suffering for a long time. On July 29th, the trio was charged with murder without aggravating circumstances. Sisters Christina Angelina and Maria Khachaturian. They called their father an evil sex addict. They also said he had subjected them to all kinds of cruel and inhuman treatment systematically, in addition to using them as slaves for years. During the investigation, the sisters claimed that the father committed horrible acts with all 3 of them and forced them for years to engage in forbidden carnal relations between relatives and against their will. Friends and family members also testified about the more than 10 incidents of sexual violence against them, of which they were aware. A medical examination confirmed that all 3 had injuries resulting from sexual abuse. The youngest of the sisters, Maria, was declared insane at the time of the facts and sent for mandatory medical treatment. The judge extended the jail sentence for another 72 hours. A court spokesman reported that, during the trial, investigators upgraded the charges from simple murder to murder under Article 105.2 of the Russian Criminal Code, making the expected punishment more severe. On July 31st, representatives of the Moscow Public Surveillance Commission visited the sisters in a pre-trial detention center. The girls complained that, after the arrest, their legal rights were violated by the police. According to what they told the commission, their rights were never explained to them, and testimony was taken without the presence and advice of their lawyers. In early August, The investigation examined the murder weapons and questioned relatives and friends of the defendants. In addition, investigators received copies of videos from surveillance cameras at the Khachaturians' home and conducted a reconstruction of the events as part of the crime scene investigation. Prosecutors concluded that the sisters acted in concert and that the younger sister, Maria, stabbed her father at least 35 times. For their legal representatives, the sisters lived in an environment of constant threat to their own lives, as they were practically isolated from the outside world by their father's orders. They were convinced that it was impossible to get outside help, and this made the situation desperate. Hence, their actions were aimed at stopping the inevitable violence committed against them. According to the girls' defense team, the act was the result of necessary self-defense. On August 2nd, the Ostankino Court of Moscow extended the remand for another 2 months. 4 days later, the Central Office of the Investigative Commission took over the case. Russian Human Rights Commissioner Tatiana Moskalkova said the court decision was too harsh, and the defense appealed the sentence. In a paradox of life in pretrial detention, the defendants were given the chance to study and talk to a psychologist for counseling, something they were forbidden to do at home by their father. In mid-August, the investigation recognized Mikhail's immoral actions towards his daughters and confirmed psychological and sexual abuse. In early September, following a mental health examination, it was recognized that the younger sister was unaware of his actions, and she was transferred to the psychiatric ward of Butyrka prison. According to the evaluation, the other 2 sisters were mentally healthy, but experts diagnosed them with battered woman syndrome. Although the court initially rejected the request for house arrest, at the end of September, sisters Maria and Angelina, the youngest and the middle one respectively, were released from the detention center. But for 3 months, they were banned from using the internet, as well as from communicating with some family members and the media. The Russian media gave various versions of what happened, but all agreed that the girls had long suffered beatings and forbidden carnal acts from their father. Thus, while the judicial process progressed, public opinion was learning, thanks to the work of journalists, of all the hell experienced by the 3 sisters since their childhood. The media began to publish audio recordings and correspondence from the girls, proving that they suffered violence of all kinds at the hands of Mikhail. The lawyers opted for a strategy that denied any planned conspiracy and focused on the spontaneity of the actions that led to the fatal attack, arguing that the sisters acted this way because of their difficult emotional state. In text messages obtained from Mikhail's phone and posted on social media by one of the attorneys, it was evident that the father threatened to take their lives and force intimacy not only on them, but also on their mother. In an April 2018 text message, he specifically threatened them that he would beat and kill them. In the message, he accused them of having sex with a friend, insulted them by calling them prostitutes, and promised that they would die as prostitutes. Transcripts of the interrogations also painted a chilling picture of mental, physical, and sexual abuse, dating back at least 4 years before the fatal attack. During the investigation, a video of the sisters' repeated abuse was released. In it, Mikhail was clearly seen screaming and hitting his daughters because he considered the apartment a mess. It was the aggressor himself who recorded everything. In this way, they addressed the complaint made by the 3 lawyers defending the sisters, who indicated that the organizations did not take the necessary measures after receiving complaints about Mikhail from the teachers of the sisters' school. It was known that Mikhail was repeatedly reported to the police, but after his death, law enforcement officials turned a blind eye and denied receiving such reports, both through the hotline and the local police station. The girl's mother, Aurelia, suspected that the police inaction was due to Mikhail's close ties to local police chiefs. Later, whistleblowers from the Russian investigative newspaper Novaya Gazeta confirmed this information. They stressed that in Russia, domestic violence is rarely discussed in public, and human rights advocates mentioned that police often ignore complaints. Activists pointed out that women face harsh prison sentences if they commit violent crimes while defending themselves against an aggressor. In the case of the 3 sisters, lawyers and activists argued that they were forced to act to save their lives and blamed poor legal protections for abuse victims in the country, where penalties for domestic violence have been softened in recent years. They noted that this left victims with only one option. The girls defended themselves, but not everyone believed in their innocence. In the more conservative Russian society, there was a strong backlash. Surprisingly, the teenage girls did not have the backing of their own family. Several of Mikhail's relatives defended him and branded the girls as liars. They argued that the alleged acts of domestic violence were simply the father's responses to their provocations, according to the relatives. They went so far as to say that they took his life for money, accusing them of having mercenary motives, despite the fact that the defendants renounced their father's inheritance. In addition, the grandmother canceled Christina's registration in the apartment. The girls' cousins stated that they lied about the beatings to defend their father. One of the aunts, Naira, assured that no evidence of sexual violence against the adolescents was found. According to her statement, medical tests would have shown that 2 of the 3 were virgins. In relation to what supposedly was not, the aunt pointed out that she had a secret boyfriend. Because of all this way of looking at the facts, the sister's uncle, together with his wife Naira, requested and was granted recognition as a victim in the investigation. The Khachaturian sisters' court case provoked a strong public reaction and was repeatedly analyzed and discussed on state television channels. In January, the prosecutor's office confirmed the allegations made by the defense that the girls had suffered beatings, constant humiliation, threats and abuse, physical and sexual violence. Prosecutors later asked the investigative committee to change the classification of the case from premeditated murder to necessary self-defense. Parshin, one of the lawyers, told state news agency TASS at the time that this basically meant the end of the criminal investigation against the sisters, who faced up to 20 years in prison for premeditated murder. However, to everyone's surprise, Victor Grimm, the same prosecutor who recommended reducing the severity of the case, made an unexpected decision. In May, they confirmed that they would impose premeditated murder charges against the sisters without explaining the drastic change. Marida Tian, who joined the defense and had experience in domestic abuse cases, linked the change of prosecutor Victor to a growing trend of disregard for human rights, especially after the controversial amendments to the Russian Constitution following the July 1st referendum. On June 14, 2019, they increased the charges to premeditated murder committed by a group of persons or as a result of a conspiracy, with sentences of 8 to 20 years in prison. The prosecution indicated unlawful acts of violence committed by the father as the motive for the murder. In response, the lawyers filed complaints with the chairman of the investigative committee, Alexander Bastrikin, insisting that the investigation should recognize self-defense as the main motive. For their part, the investigators asked to extend the sisters' ban on using the internet, communicating with relatives, and talking to the media for another month. On June 26th, the request was accepted, and the ban was extended until July 28th, then further extended. The case, quite prominent in the media, provoked a massive public outcry, with activists defending the sisters. There were major demonstrations in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other cities in their support. Activists organized many demonstrations, calling on the authorities to change the classification of the case. The young women also received support from singers, artists, journalists, and non-governmental organizations. Figures such as former presidential candidate Zhenya Sobchak and System of a Down singer Serge Tankian called for clemency for the sisters. However, activists of the Men's State, a conservative Russian organization, opposed the sisters' march, considering them cold-blooded criminals. 4 people were arrested for rioting, 3 of them male members of the male state. The public outcry was due to the fact that the case highlighted the shortcomings of the Russian judicial system. In the media and social networks, people actively debated the ethics of the judicial process. Supporters of the Khachaturian launched a petition to the investigative committee to stop the criminal proceedings. As of June 2019, more than 115,000 people had signed the petition. At the same time, many criticized the apparent happiness shown by the sisters in photos on social networks. At first, public pressure appeared to have had an impact on some events in the case. In an early defense development on July 11th, it was reported that the investigative committee planned to charge Mikhail posthumously with torture, violent acts of a sexual nature, and forced participation in sexual acts. However, in late 2019, despite discovering that the 3 sisters were abused and mistreated by their own father, the Commission of Inquiry announced charges of premeditated murder. Prosecutors argued that Mikhail's murder was clearly premeditated. First, because he was asleep, and second, because the sisters coordinated the attack by allegedly stealing the knife they had been using since the morning. Instead, the sisters' lawyers insisted that the Russian criminal code allows self-defense not only in situations of immediate aggression, but also in cases of ongoing crime. A 2019 poll by Lavanda Center found that 47% of Russian women and 33% of men considered the Khachaturian sisters' actions justified. Another poll by Mediazona, a Russian media outlet that covers justice and prisons, showed that nearly 80% of Russian women imprisoned for premeditated murder between 2016 and 2018 were trying to protect themselves from an abuser. In early 2020, the Deputy Prosecutor General reportedly refused to sign an indictment against the sisters, suggesting that investigators should reclassify the charges from murder to necessary self-defense. Although investigators objected, Prosecutor General Yuri Chaika insisted on the order and stressed the need for additional psychological and psychiatric evaluations. By May 13th of that year, an additional investigation was completed, and the murder charges still stood. In July, the Prosecutor General's office approved the indictment. After a long and convoluted pre-trial investigation, the trial began in Moscow on July 31st. The two older sisters, Christina and Angelina, were tried in the same trial. Maria, who was a minor at the time of the crime, was charged after her 18th birthday. At the beginning of the trial, the prosecution requested that the defendants be prohibited for at least 6 months from accessing the internet, making statements to the press, having contact with trial participants, and participating in public events, such as demonstrations in support of the defendants. In August 2020, when the case reached the Moscow City Court, a motion by Christina and Angelina's lawyers to have the case heard by a jury was granted. Maria was declared unfit to stand trial, and prosecutors were expected to request medical treatment for her in a separate trial. In the midst of the complicated legal process with 3 defendants, 2 separate trials and conflicting opinions of the representatives of the law, an event occurred that further complicated matters. Surprisingly, on December 4, 2020, the Basmani court in Moscow declared the investigators' refusal to initiate a criminal case against Mikhail Khachaturian illegal. Accordingly, such proceedings were to be initiated. Another development stemming from the Basmani court decision occurred in early February 2021, when the Moscow City Court returned the case against Angelina and Christina to the prosecutors until their father's actions obtained a legal qualification. In March, the posthumous case against Mikhail was opened in the Butyrsky District Court of Moscow on charges of sexual assault, sexual coercion, and causing torment. In the same process, the 3 sisters were recognized as victims. Experts during the investigation stated that the accused manipulated people through intimidation, violence, cruelty, insults, and humiliation. In addition, he resorted to assault, abuse, physical and sexual violence, and showed signs of disorder or perversion. To make matters worse, he disseminated audio-visual material with explicit, intimate images of his own daughters. A report by the Serbsky Institute for Psychological, Psychiatric, and Medical Examinations concluded that the father was a child sex offender with sexual preferences directed at his daughters. However, a lawyer representing the deceased, Olga Kalikova, requested the dismissal of the statutory rape charges due to the lack of confirming biological traces. On that occasion, he also said that the teenagers had access to their father's cell phone and that they could have sent the alleged sexually explicit film. According to his criteria, the duty of the investigation was to prove that it was Mikhail who sent this video, but it was not done. On May 29, 2022, it was reported that the investigation against Mikhail was over. He was charged with sexual violence, assault, and distribution of sexually explicit material. All of Mikhail's actions that were exposed at the trial were chilling, considering that the target of his cruelty was his own daughters. But perhaps one of the most shocking, and one that was recorded in the report, was that he forced them to dig their own graves. At the trial of the deceased abuser, it was determined that the continued abuse caused significant damage to the physical and mental health of his daughters. This finding opened the possibility of exonerating the 3 sisters. After a lengthy legal process, they were finally recognized as victims, which gave them hope of regaining their freedom, since the crime could be reclassified as self-defense. However, a final verdict has not yet been issued in Mikhail's trial. As of early October 2023, Christina and Angelina were still under house arrest, as their trial is on hold, pending the conclusion of their father's trial. Women's rights advocates argue that the sisters need psychological rehabilitation rather than a prison sentence. Recently, a new psychiatric evaluation of the trio emerged and could result in the dropping of charges against all of the sisters. The evaluation reveals that the sisters were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder at the time of the events. In the meantime, the Khachaturians await sentencing. The defense lawyers seek to have the case reviewed by the judiciary and to set a precedent in the jurisprudence on the legitimate defense of victims of abuse in Russia. So far, what we can say is that the case of the Khachaturian sisters has generated a strong reaction in public opinion. For several months, all TV channels in Russia discussed the manner of death of the abusing father. The role of the Moscow police was also heavily criticized for failing to take action against Mikhail following allegations of physical violence made by his ex-wife. It was revealed that police officers usually treat domestic violence as a family problem and provide little or no help to the victims. The Khachaturian case quickly became a cause célèbre for human rights groups who are fighting to pass a law to protect victims of domestic abuse. And, well, dear viewer, here ends today's crime story. I would be very interested to know your opinion, so please leave it in the comments of the video. Until the next criminal history.